Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on economic sociology, in today's lecture we are going to discuss on the concept of historical capitalism as given by Immanuel Wallerstein. Now, historical capitalism is one of the way to understand capitalism as a social system. We are going to focus in this lecture on how Wallerstein has kind of conceptualized the evolution of capitalism and how this evolution has been in continuation with the larger socio-economic changes taken part in other parts of the world. And therefore, we know that this is a part of understanding economic changes which has happened in the society. So, let us try to understand historical capitalism. Immanuel Wallerstein asserts in his essay Historical Capitalism with Capitalist Civilization that capitalism is a historical social structure. He argued that scholarly works on capitalism by Karl Marx and others suffered from one or two faults. So, before we go into the critique, we know that Karl Marx's understanding of capitalism is with reference to the means of production, and he was trying to understand how the emergence of private property led to the division of the society into the two classes, those who owned capital and those who did not. Now, Immanuel Wallerstein is critical of the approach that Karl Marx and other scholars took to understand capitalism. And the first critique is that these scholarly work followed logical deductive analysis, that is, first they defined what is capitalism, and then they were trying to see how the concept or the process has developed in different parts of the globe. So, it could be found in only those parts of the globe where it fitted into the definition of capitalism, and if it did not fit into it, then it was kind of assumed that these societies were absent of capitalist system. The second critique is that much of the literature on capitalism tries to look into it as a more progressive form. So, the past and the present is compared, and this capitalism is seen as a transformation from the past, which was kind of considered as foul or evil or kind of unprogressive, to a progressive reality of the present. So, it was seen as something which was necessity for progress and development, and that is therefore kind of considered as something which was kind of uniform and universal. Now, according to Wallerstein, historical capitalism has been concrete, time and space bound, integrated locus of productive activities where the fundamental economic activity has been governed by the endless accumulation of capital as an economic goal. So, here is what he would differentiate between a historical social system and historical capitalism. There is the importance of accumulation. In the traditional society, the accumulation was for the own use or it was kind of restricted. Now, when we kind of try to understand the modern social system, capitalism is in terms of accumulation for self-expansion. It is going on expanding, and therefore, it is actually competition between those who are able to use the accumulated capital further for expansion and those who do not, and therefore, it has been possible to kind of favor a few individualistic or monopolistic competition. Now, when we look into his work of historical capitalism, in order to understand the origin and working of historical capitalism, Wallerstein asks 4 questions. Number 1, what capitalism has actually been like in practice? Number 2, how does it function as a system? Number 3, why has it developed in the way it has? And the last question is, where is it presently heading? So, when we read his work, Historical Capitalism, we find an answer to all the 4 questions. And therefore, one of the most important understanding of historical capitalism is to understand that when we kind of see that there is a kind of distinction between the traditional system and what is kind of considered as capitalist modern system, Wallenstein gives us three differences. One is that you have this whole idea of accumulation which is limited. Number two, he says the circle of capital, that is the process of production, distribution, buying and selling, are incomplete in traditional society, and incomplete in the sense that there is kind of an absence of market. So, with the coming of the market, in a capitalist society, the entire process, all the process and the sub process gets commodified. So, this commodification of everything is an essential characteristic of capitalism. He argues that under capitalism, not only goods but also labor, land and even social relations are commodified, meaning that they are assigned market value and subject to buying and selling. So, everybody, even the labor who is working to produce a product, the buyer, the seller, everything has been attached to a market, everything as a commodity, and which is kind of dependent on the supply and demand. So, this commodification of everything enables Wallenstein to kind of understand the origin of capitalism, and he traces how capitalism evolved from a localized economic system to a global one. Capitalist production did not emerge naturally, but was historically constructed through colonialism, imperialism and state intervention. So, that is again trying to understand the embeddedness of the polity and the economy. No kind of a economic system could origin or grow without the support of the state, and that is why he argues that capitalism is not a natural system. In contrast to Wallenstein, there are other economists who argue that capitalism emerged spontaneously because humans are naturally inclined to trade and seek profit. According to Wallenstein, capitalism did not arise automatically from the barter economy of medieval markets. Capitalism could not have developed without the active role of the state. So, basically the competition was between those who had the capital to invest or to engage in self accumulation for expansion, and another category who did not have this capital, and even if they had a limited amount of capital. Now, with the state supported those who had capital for expansion, and therefore, the possibility of the growth of an economy is not possible without the active role of state, and the state has been actively kind of involved in terms of the origin and emergence of capitalism. Now, when let us trying to talk about the role of state and how it creates capitalism, Wallenstein challenges the common belief that capitalism thrives best when the state takes a hands-off, laissez-faire approach. So, he is against this laissez-faire or free economy, and he says that the idea or the theory of free market without any influence of the state is basically a myth. On the other hand, he argues that capitalism could not have even originated or survived without state intervention. And let us look at how the state played a role in creating capitalism. Number one, creating and enforcing private property rights. So, to make capitalism possible, state privatized land and resources, concentrating them in the hands of elites who could use them for profit. Number two, controlling and regulating labor capitalism. Capitalism requires a cheap, disciplined and mobile labor force. The state played a key role in making this happen by, number one, breaking the power of traditional guild and peasant community which had protected workers from exploitation. Number two, criminalizing vagrancy to force people into wage labor, and we see that with the emergence of market and everything being purchased and sold, labor was also being purchased and sold, and this capitalism led to the institutionalization of wage. And when wages comes in, along with it comes in the exploitation, in the sense that if the capitalist has to make a profit, he would have to appropriate from the surplus and therefore kind of suppress the workers' right that demanded fair wages and conditions. This is where the state comes in. So, the capitalist is trying to arrive at a wage which would be given to the workers, and the state plays a role in terms of curbing the workers' right and not allowing them to negotiate for a higher wage. The third, expanding market through colonialism and war. Now, capitalism requires continuous expansion, and the state played a critical role in opening up new markets through imperialism, military force, and diplomacy. Colonialism provided raw material, cotton, sugar, rubber at extremely low cost, and colonies became forced markets. They were not allowed to develop their own industries and were required to buy manufactured goods from Europe. Wars were fought over economic control, securing trade routes and expanding capitalist influence. The fourth role of state in creating capitalism is that the state provides financial and legal infrastructure for capitalists. So, capitalism could not function without legal and financial institutions that ensured stable banking and credit enforcement of contract and property laws, support for monopolies and large corporations. The example is the US federal government gives huge land grants to railroad companies. It imposed tariffs to protect American industries from foreign competition. It uses the military to suppress indigenous resistance, clearing land for capitalist expansion. The fifth role of the state is the suppressing resistance to capitalist domination. As capitalism expanded, so did resistance from workers demanding fair wage, colonized peoples fighting for independence, socialists and communists proposing alternatives to capitalism. The US and its allies supported military coups and dictatorship in Latin America, Africa, and Asia to stop socialist movement. Many of these coups were backed by corporations fearing nationalization. Example, the CIA-backed coup in Chile, 1973, which protected US business interest. So, we see that the state was an active, has been and still kind of is always supporting the capital and the expansion of capitalism vision of progress and development. Now, Wallerstein tries to say that it has not emerged autonomous, or it has not been kind of a very natural. So, there has to be a history to the evolution of the system of capitalism, and he traces us back to feudalism. So, he says there were certain ways in which feudalism kind of collapsed and therefore gave rise to capitalism. So, he traces the shift from feudalism to capitalism, emphasizing the transition was not automatic but driven by crisis and class struggles. Feudalism, which is the dominant system in medieval Europe, was based on a hierarchical structure where lords controlled land and extracted resources from peasants. Peasants worked for subsistence and paid taxes to the lords. Over the time, feudalism became unstable due to several factors and gradually it would decline. So, what are the factors for the decline of feudalism? Number one is the Black Death in the 14th century, which is kind of a large scale massacre and high number of deaths, which led to reduction in population, weakening feudal obligations. The second factor is the peasant revolt, which happened in different parts of the world, challenging feudal landlords. Third, trade expansion. By then, the trade expansion was happening at a very large scale, and this created new economic opportunity that didn't fit within the feudal structure. The fourth, the enclosure movement in England in the 16th and 18th century, and this was the turning point. Land that had been shared by peasant community was privatized. This forced peasants off the land, making them dependent on wage labor. So, when the land was taken away from them and they became without any kind of income to survive, they had to turn to wage labor. And that is how this feudalism weakened and a new system emerged, capitalism based on profit, wage labor and market competition. Instead of owning land and demanding service, elites began owning capital and hiring wage labor. The state played a key role of enforcing property laws and breaking up peasants' landholding. The enclosure movement in England created a new working class that had no choice but to sell the labor to survive. Similar such process occurred across Europe, laying the groundwork for capitalism. So, with the emergence of the wage labor, these two distinct group, that is the capitalist and the landless, we start having the emergence of a large number of middle class who were dependent on wage. So, we see that from one part of the European country where it emerges with the decline of feudalism, there is a global expansion. And here we know that Immanuel Wallerstein uses the world system theory to understand the global expansion of capitalism. And he argues that capitalism has always been a global system, not just a national economy. Since its emergence in the 16th century, capitalism has expanded worldwide, structuring economic into a hierarchical system of power and exploitation. Capitalism has most of the time dependent on kind of cheap labor, and therefore he also looks into the slave trade, which is kind of considered as crucial for the emergence of capitalism or the capitalist world system. Enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas to work on plantation. This system generated enormous profit for European economy. Colonialism ensured that wealth flowed from periphery colonized region to the core. Resources like gold, cotton, sugar were extracted at low cost. Colonized population were forced into labor system that benefited European industry. Now, when we talk about the core and the periphery, he is basically talking about the way in which the global economy is hierarchized and is unequal. In his world system theory, he is trying to give us an explanation that capitalism has basically created global inequalities, not only at the nation within the nation, but also between nation. And for this, he divided the countries into three categories: the core, the periphery and semi-periphery. The core countries are industrialized nations with wealth and political power, that is Britain, France, later the United States. The peripheral countries are exploited regions providing cheap labor and raw material, Africa, Latin America and parts of Asia. The third is the semi-peripheral countries, that is in between the developed economy and the colonized economy, and therefore they are kind of partially industrialized. Now, this system locks poorer country into dependency, making it difficult for them to develop independently. Capitalism is sustained by unequal exchange, where peripheral nations produce low-cost goods that are consumed by the core at high profit margin. So, the so-called core gaining zone, so the entire the categorization tells us that it is the core which is the gaining zone, and they never used to release the force of apparatus in terms of hard, soft or economic power at all the times, but only when the process of unequal exchange had some serious challenge. This process of unequal exchange brought satisfaction to the interest of many capitalists by definition, but not every individual interest. So, those still competing only for accumulation of comparatively lesser capital had a hard time, resulting in which they constantly tried to change things in their favor, either politically or find ways monopolistically. Now, what we talk about is that he is saying that it has emerged with the decline of the feudalism, and certainly it also has certain contradiction, and that is the reason why it is destined for a crisis, or is the question is that is capitalist countries also in a crisis. And he argues that capitalism, despite its global dominance, contains inherent contradictions that make it unstable and ultimately unsustainable. The contradictions arise from the system's core logic, the endless pursuit of profit and capital accumulation. While capitalism has survived through adaptation, these internal tensions continuously generate crises, economic, social, political and environmental crises that threatens its long-term survival. Wallenstein's main argument is that capitalism is a historical system that expands and evolves and will eventually decline. It began with European colonial expansion and continues through global financial dominance. The core exploits the periphery, but shifts in economic power may challenge the existing hierarchy. And therefore, there is need to understand the future crisis. All kinds of crises may signal the decline of the capitalist world system and the emergence of a new global order. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.